The concrete floor was cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you pull a blanket tighter. The kind that seeps through your bones and convinces your soul that warmth no longer exists in the world. I was lying on my side, my cheek pressed against the damp stone, my wrists raw from the rusted iron cuffs they had finally removed. Not out of mercy, but because my hands had swollen so badly, the metal was cutting off circulation. The guard didn't want me dying too soon. Not yet. I was still useful. My belly was enormous. 8 months, maybe more. I had lost count of the days somewhere between the 3rd week of solitary and the night they took the woman in the cell next to mine. I never heard her again. I didn't ask what happened. You learn quickly in Egyptian detention. Asking questions is its own kind of death sentence. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened the night everything changed. I was not a criminal. I was a mother, a wife, a Coptic Christian woman whose only crime was attending a house church in a back alley in Alexandria. A gathering of maybe 30 people singing hymns in whispers because the walls had ears and the streets had informants. We drank tea from chipped glasses. We read from a Bible that was held together with tape and hope. We prayed for our children. That was my crime. They raided us on a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that smells like exhaust fumes and cardamom coffee and ordinary life, and then suddenly smells like tear gas and boot leather and the copper taste of a split lip. They took 7 of us. My husband was not there that night. He had been running a fever. God's mercy, I understand now. At the time, all I felt was terror that he wouldn't know where I was. That was 11 months ago, or 12, or 13. I don't know anymore. What I know is this. I was lying on that concrete floor, in a cell roughly the size of a bathroom, in a detention facility whose name I will not say because people I love are still inside its walls. The smell. I need you to understand the smell. Mold, human waste, the ghost of disinfectant that hadn't been used in weeks, and underneath all of it, something sweet and sickening that I eventually realized was infection. Someone nearby was dying, slowly, audibly, and my baby was moving inside me. A kick, then another, as if she was saying, "Mama, I'm still here. Don't you dare give up." But I had given up. I need to be honest with you about that. Because this channel is called Trust Your Hope, and I cannot tell you what hope looks like without first showing you what it looks like when hope is completely, utterly, silently gone. I pressed my forehead to the cold stone and I tried to pray. Nothing came. I had prayed every day for 11 months. I had prayed when they interrogated me. I had prayed when they denied me medical care for the first 4 months of my pregnancy. I had prayed in the dark, in the cold, in the heat, through nausea and hunger and loneliness so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I had prayed everything. Every psalm I had memorized since childhood, every desperate, formless cry that a terrified woman in a concrete box can produce. And for 11 months, the ceiling of that cell had been the ceiling of that cell. Stone, mold, silence. That night, I didn't even have words left. I just lay there, one hand on my belly, and I whispered the only thing I had remaining. I can't feel you anymore. 5 words. The most honest prayer I have ever prayed in my life. I can't feel you anymore. And listen, if you're watching this right now in a dark room, if you're in a place where God feels completely absent, if you've prayed and prayed and heard nothing back, I am not going to tell you that's weakness. That was me, on that floor, 8 months pregnant, alone. But here is what I didn't know, what I could not possibly have known, lying there in the dark with my cheek on cold stone and my faith reduced to 5 broken words. I was less than 6 hours away from the most impossible thing I have ever witnessed in my life. Something was coming into that prison that no guard could stop, no lock could hold out, no amount of concrete and iron and ideology could keep away. And when it arrived, 200 people inside that facility would never be the same again. His name was Lieutenant Ferris, not a warlord from the desert, not a masked fighter with a foreign accent and an imported ideology. That would have been almost easier to understand. No, Lieutenant Ferris was Egyptian, born in Cairo, educated. He wore a pressed uniform with brass buttons that caught the fluorescent light in the interrogation room. He smelled of cigarettes and something sharper underneath. Cologne, maybe, or the particular smell of a man who has convinced himself that cruelty is a form of patriotism. He had a habit of tapping his pen against his notepad when he was deciding something. Tap, tap, tap. Like a metronome counting down to a verdict that had already been decided before you entered the room. I want you to understand Lieutenant Ferris, not because he deserves your understanding, but because the miracle I'm about to tell you is bigger when you understand the size of the man who stood against it. He was not a monster in the way movies show you monsters. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He was worse than that. He was calm. He sat across from me in the interrogation room 3 days after they arrested me, my wrists still bleeding from the cuffs, my stomach visible even beneath the shapeless detention garment they had given me. And he opened his notepad, clicked his pen, and said, with the tone of a man ordering coffee, "Tell me the names of everyone in that room." I said nothing. Tap, tap, tap. "You understand," he said, "that protecting these people helps no one. Not them, not you, certainly not." He gestured at my belly with a pen. That. He called my daughter that. Something hardened in me in that moment. Something that even 11 months of concrete floors and interrogations and hunger couldn't fully break because it had been forged in that single word, that, as if she were not a person, as if she were leverage, evidence, an inconvenience to be managed. Her name, I said, my voice cracking but my eyes steady, is going to be Miriam. Lieutenant Ferris looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that has no warmth anywhere near it, just calculation. Miriam, he repeated, writing it down. How optimistic of you. Let me take you back to the Tuesday it all began, because you need to see what brought me to that interrogation table. Alexandria in the early evening smells like salt water and diesel and the particular sweetness of fatir bread frying in oil somewhere around the corner. The Mediterranean light at that hour turns everything amber. The old Ottoman buildings, the rusted balconies with their hanging laundry, the faces of the street vendors packing up for the day. It is a beautiful city. I want you to know that. I want you to know that beauty and danger can occupy the same geography without apology. Our house church met in the ground floor apartment of a man named Bishoy, a tailor whose shop front served as the most ordinary cover in the world. We came in ones and twos, never together, never at the same time. We sat on plastic chairs and foam cushions arranged in a rough circle. Sister Hannah, who was 73 years old and had survived the 1981 Coptic riots, always brought a thermos of strong black tea. Brother Marcos brought his daughter, who was 9 and had already memorized more scripture than most adults I know. We were 31 people that night. We were singing, quietly, always quietly, the way Coptic Christians in Egypt have sung for centuries, with the sound barely escaping the walls, when the door came in, not knocked on, came in, as in shattered, as in 4 seconds of normal life and then splintered wood and shouting, and the beam of flashlights cutting through the dim apartment like something surgical and violent. Everyone down, down, hands where I can see them. I remember the thermos hitting the floor, tea spreading across the tile, dark and steaming, like a small, ordinary tragedy inside the larger one. I remember Brother Marcos throwing himself across his daughter, instinctively, without thought, the way fathers do. I remember the Bible sliding under the couch, Sister Hannah's hand pushing it there, calm as a woman hanging laundry. And I remember the hands on my arms, 2 officers, 1 on each side, not looking at my face, not registering that I was 8 months pregnant, just gripping and pulling and moving, because I was a target in a room full of targets, and targets don't have faces. They loaded us into 2 vans, no windows. The floor vibrated with the engine. Someone was praying in Coptic, the ancient liturgical words, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. I pressed my back against the metal wall of the van, both hands on my belly, and I breathed. Miriam, I thought. Stay still, baby. Stay still. The interrogations began immediately. They separated us within the hour. I never saw most of the others again. Not in there. I have found some of them since. Others, I am still looking. Lieutenant Ferris took a personal interest in my case. I learned later why. A pregnant Coptic woman arrested at an illegal house church gathering, refusing to name names. I was, in his words, a useful narrative, a way to send a message, keep the community afraid, keep the underground churches underground enough to feel criminal, even though the Egyptian constitution, in theory, guarantees religious freedom. In theory. Ferris had been building a file on our network for months. He knew about Bishoy's apartment. He knew about Sister Hannah. He knew about the Bible tailor, a man in Aswan who printed pages at night and smuggled them north in bolts of fabric. What he wanted from me were the connections, the links between groups, the names of the pastors who moved between cells, names I did not give him. Session after session, week after week, questions wrapped in false warmth, then questions wrapped in threat. Then, when I still said nothing, the particular punishment of bureaucratic cruelty, denied medical care, denied exercise, placed in a smaller cell, denied the letter my husband finally managed to get through a Red Cross contact. I only learned about it months later. They gave it to me never. And through all of it, through every session, every deprivation, every cold night on that floor, Ferris would end each interrogation the same way. He would close his notepad, click his pen, stand, and before leaving, he would glance at my stomach, growing larger every week, undeniable, insistent, alive, and say with that same empty smile, "We have time, both of us." What he meant was, the baby is coming whether you cooperate or not. And when it does, we will see how strong your convictions really are. He was betting that the moment my daughter entered the world, she would become the leverage he hadn't been able to manufacture through questioning. He was not wrong to think that a mother would do anything for her child. He was catastrophically wrong about what anything would look like. Because in approximately 3 months, in that same prison, on that same cold floor, something was going to happen on the night Miriam decided to enter the world. Something Lieutenant Ferris, with all his pressed buttons and tapping pens and calculated smiles, had no category for. Something that would empty a corridor of guards, reduce a hardened interrogation officer to a man sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, unable to speak. Something that a prison doctor, a secular, university-trained Egyptian physician who had seen everything, would write in his report as the only honest thing a man can write when his science fails him completely. Unexplainable. I was alone in that cell on the night it happened. My contractions had started at midnight, and I had never been more terrified in my life. But I had also never been less alone. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a prison at 3 a.m. It is not peaceful silence. It is not the silence of a sleeping house or a quiet garden or the desert at dawn. It is the silence of suppression, the silence of hundreds of human beings, all choosing simultaneously not to make a sound, because sound attracts attention, and attention in a place like this costs you something you cannot afford to lose. I learned to live inside that silence. I learned the difference between the footsteps of the night guard who didn't care, shuffling, slow, already thinking about the end of his shift, and the footsteps of the one who did. The one who cared was worse. The one who cared had something to prove. I learned that the water pipe in the east wall groaned at exactly 4:17 every morning, and for 3 weeks I thought I was a person. I learned that the woman 2 cells down from me, I never knew her name, never saw her face, only knew her through the wall, hummed to herself when she was afraid. A low, tuneless sound, like a machine that has forgotten what music is, but remembers the motion of it. She stopped humming sometime in the 5th month. I did not ask why. I told you, you learn quickly. Let me tell you what my days look like, because I need you to feel the weight of what I was carrying before I tell you how it was lifted. I need you to understand that what happened on the night Miriam was born did not happen to a woman who was doing fine. It happened to a woman who was completely, structurally, in every measurable way, broken. I woke each morning on that concrete floor. They gave me a mat eventually, thin as a folded newspaper, which I was grateful for in a way that frightened me, because gratitude for a thin mat means something has happened to your sense of what you deserve. My back ached constantly. By the 7th month, the pain was a living thing, curled at the base of my spine, reminding me every single moment that my body was doing something enormous in a place designed to make you feel like nothing. Breakfast was bread. Sometimes there was something beside it, sometimes not. I had 1 hour of exercise in a small concrete yard. The sky above it was a perfect rectangle, blue in summer, white in winter, always framed by the same 4 walls, as if the world had been reduced to exactly that much. I walked circuits, round and round, my hand on my belly, counting steps. Sometimes I counted to 1,000. Sometimes I stopped at 3 because counting felt too much like hope, and hope, in those months, felt like a trap. I prayed. Oh, I prayed. Listen to me. I prayed everything I knew how to pray. I prayed the morning prayers of the Coptic liturgy that my grandmother had taught me, the ancient Agpeya, the Book of Hours, running the words through my mind like water through cupped hands, because I had no book, only memory, only the inheritance of faith passed down through generations of Egyptian Christians who had survived Romans and Arabs and Ottomans, and now this. I prayed the Psalms, every one I could remember. The Lord is my shepherd. Yes. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Yes, exactly that. I will fear no evil. And here is where I stopped. Every time. because I did fear. I feared enormously. I feared for Miriam. I feared for my husband somewhere outside those walls, not knowing if I was alive. I feared the birth, alone on a concrete floor, without a doctor, without my mother, without anyone who loved me. I feared that I had been forgotten, not by people, by God. I want to stop here and speak directly to you. Yes, you watching this right now. Maybe you are in a comfortable place. Maybe you have never been in a prison. Maybe the hardest thing you faced this week was a difficult conversation, or a bill you couldn't pay, or a relationship that is quietly falling apart. And maybe you are tempted to think, my problems are too small to bring to God. My suffering doesn't compare. Don't you dare think that. But also, maybe you are in your own kind of prison. Maybe the walls of yours are made of depression, or grief, or a marriage that feels like solitary confinement, or an addiction that has become a cell you can't find the door of. Maybe you have prayed and prayed, and the ceiling has felt like stone. I am not going to tell you that I had the right words, and that's why God answered. I had no words. I had nothing. That is exactly the point. Hold on to that. I'll come back to it. In the 6th month, something happened that I have never fully recovered from. There was a woman in the cell directly across the corridor from mine. I could see her through the small, barred window in my door. Just a sliver of her, just enough to know she existed. She was older than me, perhaps 50. She had gray threading through her dark hair, and she sat in the same position every day, cross-legged on her mat, hands in her lap, head slightly bowed. She looked like she was waiting, not desperately, just waiting, with a patience I could not understand and could not stop watching. One day, through the slot in her door where food was passed, I saw her push something out into the corridor. Small, flat. The guard picked it up, looked at it, dropped it like it burned him, and walked away. Later, a different guard, younger, less certain of his cruelty, kicked it toward my door instead of taking it. It slid under my door. A small card, handmade. On one side, drawn in pencil so faint it was almost invisible, was a cross. On the other side, in tiny, careful Arabic script, was a single verse. He has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Psalm 22:24. I held that card for a long time. I pressed it against my belly, against Miriam, as if the words could travel through skin and muscle and reach her before they reached me, as if I wanted her to receive the promise first. Then I held it to my chest, and I wept. For the first time in months, I actually wept. Not the dry, exhausted, not crying that had become my daily state. Actual tears, actual sound, the kind of crying that empties something and leaves space for something else to grow. I looked through my door window. the woman across the corridor was looking at me. She nodded. Once. Slowly. I never saw her again after that week. I don't know where they took her. I don't know her name. I think about her constantly. I think she was one of those people God places in specific locations at specific moments. Not by accident, not by coincidence. Because he knew that a woman 2 cells away was about to give up completely, and he wanted to get a message to her before she did. He has not hidden his face, even when it feels like he has, especially when it feels like he has. The 8th month was the hardest. My body was no longer quietly enduring. It was loudly, insistently, desperately demanding things I could not provide. Proper nutrition, space to move, rest that the hard floor refused to give. My ankles swelled, my vision blurred occasionally, frightening that, a sudden graying at the edges that lasted seconds but felt like a warning. I banged on my door one night and demanded to see a doctor. The guard told me to be quiet. I banged again. He told me something uglier. I sat back down on my mat. I put both hands on my belly, and I made Miriam a promise. I am going to get you out of here, I whispered. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I promise you, you are not going to grow up inside these walls. Your first real breath of free air is coming. I don't know where it's coming from, but it's coming. Miriam kicked, hard, decisive, as if she was holding me to it. And then, one evening in the 9th month, 3 weeks before she came, I had a visitor, not Lieutenant Ferris, not a guard, a woman, civilian clothes. She said she was from an NGO doing welfare checks. I was skeptical because welfare checks in that facility were largely performative, a paper exercise for international compliance. But she sat across from me in the visitation room and she looked at me. Actually looked at me, the way people rarely do in institutional settings. And she asked, quietly in Arabic, "Is there anything you need? Anything at all?" I almost said no. Automatic, protective. The reflex of someone who has learned that need is vulnerability, and vulnerability is danger. But something stopped me. Prayer, I heard myself say. I need someone to pray for me. I've been praying for months and I can't feel God anymore. I need someone who still can. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table, past the rules, past the guard's raised eyebrow, and she covered my hands with hers, and she prayed, quietly, quickly, in the kind of Arabic that carries the weight of genuine belief. She prayed for Miriam. She prayed for my husband. She prayed for the night of the birth, specifically, pointedly, as if she knew something I didn't. And she said these words that I have never forgotten. Lord, let that night be a testimony that outlives this prison. Let what you do in that cell be so impossible that no one who sees it can explain it away. Let the darkness of this place become the backdrop for your brightest light. She squeezed my hands, stood up, and before the guard escorted her out, she leaned down and said, barely above a whisper, "When it starts, when the contractions begin, don't be afraid. You won't be alone. I don't know how I know that. I just know." 3 weeks later, at midnight, the contractions began, and I remembered every word she said. But remembering words and believing them are two entirely different things. And in those first hours of labor, alone on that floor, with the cold pressing up through the thin mat and the silence pressing down from every direction, I was terrified. I called out for the guard. No one came. I called again. Silence. And then, because I had nothing left, because every prayer I knew had been spent, because the woman across the corridor was gone, and the NGO woman was gone, and my husband was somewhere beyond 4 walls I couldn't see through, I did the only thing left to do. I called out a name, not the ancient liturgical name, not the formal theological name, just Jesus. One word, one name, into the silence of a prison at 3 a.m. And that single syllable is where everything changes. I need to clarify something before I go further. I know what you might be thinking. She's Coptic Christian. She's been praying to Jesus her whole life. What do you mean, forbidden prayer? And you're right that I was raised in the church, baptized as an infant in the Coptic tradition that stretches back to St. Mark himself, the same St. Mark who walked the streets of Alexandria, the same city where they arrested me. I grew up with icons on the walls and incense in the air and the ancient Coptic liturgy filling the church every Sunday like something older than history, older than language, older almost than breath itself. I knew the creeds. I knew the prayers. I had memorized scripture since I was 6 years old. But here's the thing, the uncomfortable, humbling, earth-shifting thing that I discovered on the floor of that prison cell at midnight, my body in the first grip of labor, alone in a way I had never been alone in my life. I had never actually talked to him. Not like this. I had prayed at him. I had recited to him. I had performed the correct liturgical forms with the correct liturgical words in the correct liturgical posture, and all of it was real. All of it was sincere. All of it came from a genuine heart. I am not dismissing any of it. The ancient prayers of my tradition are sacred, and I still love them. But there is a difference, and I cannot explain this difference theologically, only experientially. There is a profound difference between reciting a prayer and crying out to a person. That night, I ran out of liturgy, and for the first time in my life, I just talked. The first contraction hit at 12:04 a.m. I know the time because there was a clock on the corridor wall, visible through the small barred window in my door, and I had spent months staring at it the way drowning people stare at the surface of the water, not because it helps, but because you need something to fix your eyes on when everything else is moving. 12:04 a.m. The pain was, I want to find a word for it, that doesn't sound like every other description of labor pain you've ever heard. Because this was more than physical. The physical was enormous, yes. A tightening that started low and spread upward like a hand squeezing everything inside me simultaneously. But underneath the physical was something else. A terror so specific and so cold it had its own texture. Because I knew with absolute certainty that there was no midwife coming, no doctor, no mother holding my hand, no husband's voice, no sterile room with soft lighting and a team of people whose entire job was to make sure my daughter and I survived the next several hours. There was a thin mat, a concrete floor beneath it, 4 walls, a clock I could barely see, and me. I called out for the guard. I banged on the door, not easy with a contraction moving through you, not dignified, not the way you imagine yourself in the moments that matter. But I banged and I called, and I heard my own voice echo down that corridor and return to me, unanswered. I banged again. Footsteps, slow, uninterested, quiet. "I'm in labor," I said. "I need a doctor. Please, I need..." Morning shift handles medical. Morning shift is 6 hours away. The baby won't wait for... The footsteps moved away. The corridor returned to silence. I slid down the door to the floor. Another contraction. I pressed my back against the cold metal and breathed the way I had read about. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, controlled. But controlling your breath when terror has its hands around your throat is like trying to fold a map in a hurricane. Think, I told myself. Think. But thinking requires a kind of mental quiet that pain and fear conspire to destroy. Every coherent thought I reached for dissolved before I could hold it. I couldn't remember what I'd read about labor. I couldn't remember the prayers. I couldn't remember, God forgive me, I couldn't remember the face of my husband clearly. It was like the pain was erasing things, reaching into my memory and blurring the edges of everything I needed most. What remained, when everything else had been blurred or erased or shouted down by fear and pain, was one thing, one name. Jesus. I said it quietly at first, not as a prayer exactly, more like the way you say a person's name in a dark room when you think they might be there, but you're not certain. Tentative, half hoping. Jesus. The contraction subsided, the brief grace period between waves. I pulled my knees up carefully, one hand braced on the floor, and I tried to breathe through the aftermath, that particular exhaustion that follows each contraction, the body's desperate attempt to recover before the next one arrives. And in that space, that small, temporary, precious space between pain and pain, I started to talk. Not recite, not perform, talk. I don't know how to do this, I said, out loud, to the empty cell, to the ceiling, to him if he was listening, and I genuinely did not know if he was. I've been praying for almost a year, and I don't know if any of it reached you. I don't know if you're here. I don't know if you can hear me through these walls. Another contraction building. I felt it gathering at the base of my spine like a wave forming far out at sea. You can feel it coming before it arrives, which is its own particular cruelty. I know the theology, I said quickly before the wave hit. I know what I'm supposed to believe. I know you died and rose, and you're seated at the right hand of the Father, and you intercede for us. I know all of that. I learned all of that. But right now, the contraction hit. I stopped talking. I breathed. I pressed my forehead to my knees, and I held on to myself, because there is nothing else to hold on to. The wave peaked, enormous, insistent, undeniable, and then, slowly, it released. Right now, I continued, my voice rougher now, stripped of any remaining formality. I am on a floor. I am alone. My daughter is coming, and there is no one here. And I am so afraid. I am so afraid I can't think. I can't pray. I can't do anything except tell you that I need you to be real right now. Not theologically, not historically. Here, in this cell, in this moment. I need you to be as real as this floor is real as this pain is real. I stopped. My hands were shaking. I don't know what that looks like, I admitted. I don't know what I'm asking for exactly. I'm asking. I'm here. I'm asking now. And I need you to hear this carefully, because what I'm about to describe is not the dramatic miracle. That comes later. What I'm about to describe is something quieter and in some ways more profound, because it happened entirely inside me, invisible to any observer, unmeasurable by any instrument. The fear changed, not disappeared. I want to be precise here because I think people sometimes tell stories of faith where fear vanishes instantly and everything becomes golden and easy, and that is not what happened to me, and I don't think it's helpful to pretend otherwise. The fear did not disappear, but it changed. It went from being a cold, expanding, suffocating thing, the kind of fear that fills every available space and leaves no room for anything else, to something smaller, contained, as if someone had taken the ocean of it and put it in a jar. Still real, still visible, still fear, but bounded, held, and in the space that opened up around it, warmth. I know how that sounds. I know. I am sitting here telling you that I felt warmth in a cold prison cell, and I understand exactly how that reads to a skeptic. But I am not a woman who exaggerates. Ask anyone who knows me. I am precise. I am measured. I am the kind of person who says, I think, and it seemed like, and I can't be certain. So hear me when I tell you with complete certainty, something warm moved through that cell. Not the temperature. The walls were still cold. The floor was still cold. The air was still the particular stale cold of a sealed room in the small hours of the night. Not the temperature. Something else. Something that entered not through my skin, but through something underneath my skin. Something that went directly to the place where the fear was living and surrounded it. I sat very still. Another contraction coming. I could feel it. But before it hit, in that last second of relative quiet, I heard something not audible. Not a voice in the room. Not a sound my ears processed. This came from somewhere entirely different. The place where you know things you have no rational explanation for knowing. It was not words exactly, but if I were to translate it into words, the closest I can get is this. I am here. I have always been here. You are not alone in this room. 5 seconds, maybe. Then the contraction arrived. But I moved through it differently. I breathed through it with something underneath the pain that had not been there before. Something I can only call company. The sense that the cell, which had been sealed and empty and hostile, was now somehow occupied. That I was not the only one in it. Between contractions, I kept talking. I told him things I had never told anyone. Things about my marriage, the beautiful parts and the hard parts. I told him about the night they arrested me, the particular guilt of having survived the raid more intact than others, the weight of names I hadn't given up, and the constant wondering whether my silence had cost those people something worse than my giving in would have. I told him about my mother, gone 4 years now, a quiet woman who smelled of jasmine soap and olive oil, and whose hands I would have given anything in the world to feel holding mine in that moment. I told him I was angry. I said it plainly. I am angry. I don't understand why this is happening. I don't understand why you allowed this. I don't understand what any of this is for. And I need you to know that. I need you to know that I'm not entering this conversation pretending everything is fine, because everything is not fine. And if you are who you say you are, you already know that. Another contraction, harder, closer together now. Time was moving. Miriam was coming. I need you to help me bring her into the world, I said, between breaths, my voice down to something barely above a whisper now. Hoarse, exhausted, entirely honest. I need you to be her midwife tonight, because there is no one else. I need your hands to be in this room, because I cannot do this alone. And after, if we get through tonight, I need you to tell me what this was all for, because I need it to mean something. I need this suffering to mean something. I need Miriam's first night on earth to mean something beyond just surviving it. I paused. Please. One word, the most complete prayer I have ever prayed. Please. Somewhere in the next hour. I cannot give you an exact time because I had stopped watching the clock and started existing entirely inside each wave of pain and recovery. Something else shifted. The contractions were serious now, the kind that demand everything, the kind that leave no mental space for theology or fear or memory or hope, only breath and endurance and the ancient animal knowledge that this is happening whether you are ready or not, whether you are in a hospital or field or prison cell, whether anyone is coming or not. I was lying on my side, the thin mat between me and the floor, my back against the wall, breathing through the peak of a contraction that felt like the longest one yet, when I heard it from outside my door. Footsteps, but not the slow, indifferent shuffle of the night guard. These were different, purposeful, more than one person, and underneath them, underneath the footsteps, something else, something I could not immediately identify, a sound I had not heard in almost a year, a woman's voice, calm, instructing someone, speaking in rapid, precise Arabic. Get the door open, now, move. Keys, the lock turning. My door opened, light flooded in, not the harsh fluorescent of an interrogation room, but the softer, warmer light of the corridor. And in the doorway stood a woman I had never seen before. Not in a guard's uniform, not in civilian clothes, in medical scraps, pale green, slightly too large for her, as if borrowed from someone else in a hurry. She was carrying a bag. She was looking at me with the focused, unshockable expression of someone who has seen exactly this situation before and knows precisely what to do. She stepped into the cell. She knelt beside me. She put her hand on my arm and she looked directly into my eyes, and she said in the most ordinary, grounding, human voice I had heard in almost a year, "I'm here. You're not alone. Let's bring this baby into the world." I stared at her. "Who?" I started. "Later," she said simply, already opening her bag, already moving with the quiet efficiency of someone whose hands know what to do while her mouth saves breath for what matters. "Right now, breathe with me, like this, in through the nose." I breathed with her, and somewhere in the part of me that was beyond exhaustion and pain and 11 months of unanswered prayers, something that had been held very tightly for a very long time, let go. But who was she? How did she get past the guards? How did she know at exactly that hour in exactly that cell that I needed her? Those questions didn't come until morning. That night, I was too busy meeting my daughter, and the night was not finished surprising me, not even close. Her name was Dina. That's all she told me in the brief spaces between contractions when speech was possible. Dina. No last name. No explanation yet of how she had appeared at my door at 12:40 in the morning with a medical bag and a calm that belonged to someone who had either seen everything or feared nothing, or both. I didn't push for more. She was right. Later. Right now, there was only this: the work of bringing a life into the world in a place designed to extinguish it. Dina worked with a quietness that I found more reassuring than any amount of words could have been. She checked me, clinically, efficiently, her face giving nothing away that would frighten me, And then she sat back on her heels and she said, "You're further along than you think. She's coming fast." "How fast?" A pause. The specific pause of a medical professional deciding how much truth serves the patient. "Fast," she said again. I understood. For a while, maybe 40 minutes, maybe an hour, time had become completely elastic, stretching and compressing with each contraction. Things were hard, but they were manageable. Dina coaching me through each wave, her hand on my back during the peaks, her voice steady and low, the Arabic of it familiar and grounding, something to fix my mind on when the pain tried to take everything. Between contractions, she gave me water, small sips from a bottle she produced from her bag, and the taste of it, clean and cold, was so shockingly normal in that abnormal place that I almost wept again. "Where did you come from?" I asked during one of those brief reprieves. "I told you, later." "At least tell me, are you a doctor?" She glanced at me. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. "I'm what you needed," she said, which was not an answer, and was somehow the most complete answer possible. I want to stop here and speak to you directly for a moment. I know there are people watching this who are in the medical field, doctors, nurses, midwives, people who understand what it means to deliver a baby in an unsterile environment, without proper equipment, without backup, without the infrastructure that modern obstetrics considers the absolute minimum. I know what you're calculating right now. I know the risk factors you're running through your mind. You are not wrong. Everything that could go wrong in that situation was a real possibility. Infection, hemorrhage, fetal distress, complications that require intervention beyond what one person with a bag can manage in a prison cell. I understood this. Somewhere underneath the pain and the strange warmth I had been carrying since my prayer, I understood exactly what the risks were. And then, at approximately 2 a.m., the situation stopped being manageable. It started with Dina's face, that careful, controlled, professional stillness. It shifted, not dramatically, just enough that I saw it. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hands, which had been moving with complete confidence, paused for 1 second too long. "What?" I said immediately. "What is it?" "Stay calm," she said, which is what medical professionals say when they need themselves to stay calm and are using the instruction to buy time. "Dina," she looked at me, and in that look was the truth she was trying to decide whether to give me. "The cord," she said quietly. "I need you to listen to me very carefully and do exactly what I say." The umbilical cord. I knew enough to know what that meant. I had read enough in the months of my pregnancy to understand that certain cord complications during delivery are the kind of thing that turn routine births into emergencies in seconds. The kind of thing that, in a hospital, triggers a room full of people moving fast and a decision made in under a minute. We were not in a hospital. There was no room full of people. There was Dina and me and a prison cell. And my daughter, who had waited 8 months to arrive and had chosen the most impossible circumstances imaginable to make her entrance. "Tell me what to do," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected, steadier than I had any right to be. I know, that was not my own steadiness. Something was holding me from the inside in a way I cannot clinically explain and will not try to. Dina told me what she needed. I will not describe the medical specifics, not because I'm protecting you from difficulty, but because the technical details are not the point of this story, and I am not a medical professional giving instruction. What I will tell you is this. What she was asking required something from my body that my body, at that point, was not certain it could give. "I can't," I said, not defeatist, honest. "I don't think I can do what you're describing. I don't have anything left." "You have more than you think," Dina said. "You don't know that." "Yes," she said, and something in her voice shifted into a register I had not heard from her yet. Quieter, more certain, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with medical training. "I do." And then the second thing happened. The thing that I have spent 2 years trying to find adequate language for and have consistently failed. The corridor outside my cell, which had been silent since Dina arrived, the night guard apparently having retreated to whatever indifference keeps night guards in their posts, erupted. Not in violence, not in alarm, in sound. Shouting, multiple voices, male voices, deep and disoriented, the sound of people who have been abruptly pulled from sleep or routine into something they do not have a framework for. Boots on concrete, fast. The particular sound of authority that has encountered something it cannot process and is responding with volume because volume is all it has. Through my door window, I could see it, that sliver of corridor, that narrow rectangle of the world outside my cell. I saw lights, not the corridor's fluorescent lights. Those were on, the same sickly yellow-white they always were. I mean something else. Something moving in the corridor that was not a flashlight, not a phone screen, not any light source I could identify by its quality or its direction, because it didn't seem to come from anywhere. It simply was. Present in the corridor the way heat is present in a room, filling space, sourceless, impossible to locate or trace back to an origin point. The shouting outside intensified. Dina did not look up. She was entirely focused on me, on Miriam, on the work in front of her. And her focus was so complete, so sealed, that I remember thinking, she is not surprised. In the middle of whatever was happening in that corridor, whatever was making trained security personnel shout and run and collide with each other in confusion. Dina was not surprised, as if she had known it was coming, as if it was part of the plan. "I need you to push now," Dina said. "What is happening out there?" "Push," she said again, calm as still water. "What's happening out there is not your concern right now. What's happening in here is." A contraction arrived, enormous, the kind that removes all choice, all negotiation, all thought beyond the single imperative of the body doing what it was designed to do. I pushed everything I had, everything I'd been told I didn't have, the full reserves of 11 months of surviving what should not have been survivable, poured into a single sustained effort that felt like it lasted forever and lasted seconds simultaneously. Dina's hands were sure, her voice was steady. Again, "Don't stop, keep going, she's almost here." Outside, more shouting. A sound I could not immediately identify, and then suddenly could. It was the sound of a man on his knees, the particular acoustics of someone's voice when they are no longer standing. Low, broken, repeating something I couldn't make out over the sound of my own effort and my own breathing, and the roaring in my ears that comes when your body is giving absolutely everything it has. "Again," Dina said, and her voice had changed. Still calm, but now carrying something underneath it. Something bright and urgent and almost joyful. "Now." And then, and then, the sound that entered that cell at 2:23 a.m. was the most extraordinary sound I have ever heard in my life. I have heard music that made me weep. I have heard the Coptic liturgy sung by a full choir in the Cathedral of St. Mark, and felt the ancient harmonics of it move through me like electricity. I have heard my mother's voice. I have heard my husband say my name in the way he says it when he thinks no one else can hear. None of it prepared me for the sound of my daughter crying for the first time in a prison cell, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the impossible. Miriam, furious, indignant, perfectly, magnificently, undeniably alive. Dina held her up, and I want to find words for what I saw. I want language adequate to the image of my daughter in that dim cell, her first seconds of existence. But I cannot. I can tell you the details. She was small. She was loud. She was covered in the evidence of her arrival. Her face was scrunched in magnificent outrage at being ushered into such an absurd place through such an absurd process. And she was perfect, every cell of her. Perfect. I reached for her, and Dina placed her on my chest, and I felt the weight of her, the warmth of her, the impossible realness of her against my skin, and something in me that had been clenched for 11 months Something I hadn't even known was clenched, opened. I don't have a better word than that. Opened. Like a fist becoming a hand. Like a door that has been locked so long you forgot it was a door. I held my daughter in a prison cell, and I laughed and wept simultaneously, which I did not know was physically possible until that moment. But the story was not finished, because the corridor outside my cell had gone quiet, not the suppressive silence of routine. Something different, something that had texture and weight and meaning. The silence of people who have witnessed something and do not yet have words for what they witnessed. And then a voice, one voice, male, older by the sound of it, speaking Arabic in the cadence of a man who is choosing his words with the care of someone who knows that what he says next will follow him for the rest of his life. What was that light? No one answered him. I said, his voice broke slightly, steadied, continued. What was that light in this corridor? Still nothing. And then another voice, younger, uncertain, frightened in the specific way of someone who is not frightened of a thing they understand, but of a thing they don't. I don't know. I don't know what that was. A long silence, and then, barely audible, the older voice again, almost to himself. There was someone standing there, in the light. I saw someone standing there. Dina was cleaning her hands, methodically. The work of the birth complete, her focus now on the practical necessities of the aftermath. She wrapped Miriam in a cloth from her bag, clean, soft, impossibly clean for where we were, and she looked at me with that expression I still could not fully read. Who was in that corridor? I asked her. She looked at me for a long moment. Ask me in the morning, she said. I'm asking now. She was quiet. Then she said, carefully, precisely, with the weight of someone who means every syllable. Someone who has been standing in this corridor since the night you arrived here. You just couldn't see him until tonight. My skin went to gooseflesh from my scalp to my feet. Miriam made a sound against my chest, small, content, the sound of someone who has arrived somewhere and decided, against all available evidence, that it is safe. I looked down at her face. Then I looked up at the corridor window. The light was gone, but the silence it had left behind was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of aftermath. The silence of a place that has been visited by something so far beyond its walls' ability to contain that the walls themselves seem somehow different now. Thinner, maybe. More permeable. Less final. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on that thin mat with my daughter on my chest, her breath warm against my collarbone, her heartbeat tapping against mine like a conversation between two people who have survived something together. And I waited for morning, because morning was going to require explanation. The guards in that corridor were going to need to talk about what they saw. The prison doctor was going to be called. Lieutenant Ferris was going to hear about it. And Dina, who had appeared from nowhere and disappeared before the first shift change, whose name I only had one part of, who had known things she had no rational means of knowing, and remained unshaken by things that shook everyone around her. Dina was going to have to be explained. Except that one morning came, and the questions came, and eventually, much later, the investigations came. No one could explain Dina. Not the intake records, not the guard logs, not the security footage, not the NGO visitor list. Dina was not in any of them, as if she had never been there at all, except that my daughter was alive, and I was alive, and 7 guards had spent the night of February the 14th unable to explain what they had seen standing in a prison corridor at 2:23 in the morning. And that is where the real miracle begins. I need to tell you something before I take you into that corridor. I am not a person who uses the word miracle lightly. I was raised in a tradition that takes the supernatural seriously, but also, paradoxically, a tradition rigorous enough about its own history that we distinguish carefully between genuine divine intervention and wishful thinking dressed in religious language. My father was an engineer. My mother was a school teacher. I was raised to ask questions, to examine evidence, to be honest about what I know and what I don't know, and where the line between them falls. So when I tell you what happened in that corridor, I am not telling you what I felt happened, or what I believe happened, or what I interpreted through the lens of my faith. I am telling you what 7 people, 7 separate individuals with no coordinated motive to fabricate the same story, reported independently to the prison administration the following morning. 7 people who had not spoken to each other between the event and the reporting. 7 people whose accounts aligned in the specific details that matter. I am telling you what a prison doctor with 22 years of medical experience wrote in an official report and then was ordered to redact, and then refused to fully redact, because there are things a person with integrity cannot bring themselves to officially unsee. I am telling you what Lieutenant Ferris, when he finally sat across from me 3 days later, could not explain. And I watched Lieutenant Ferris, a man I had seen reduce grown men to compliance with the sheer force of his certainty, sit in his own interrogation room, across from a woman who had just given birth on a prison floor, and have nothing to say. That silence was its own testimony. Let me take you into the corridor. His name was Officer Ramadan, 29 years old, 8 years in the prison service. By every account, including his own later, not a man given to imagination or flights of spiritual feeling. He described himself in his statement as not particularly religious. I perform the Friday prayers when I remember. I fast Ramadan. Beyond that, I don't think much about God. He was the senior officer on the night shift. He had been sitting at the corridor desk, doing what night shift officers do at 2 a.m., which is fighting the particular battle between consciousness and sleep that institutional night work requires, when he heard it. Not the sound from my cell, not my voice or Dina's voice, or eventually Miriam's voice. Before any of that, a sound in the corridor itself. He described it in his statement as like air moving, but from the inside, like the air in the corridor was being displaced by something passing through it, except nothing was passing through it, nothing visible. He stood up. He looked down the corridor toward my cell. Cell 14, East Wing, the end of the row. And he saw the light. I want you to understand what Officer Ramadan was looking at when he saw the light, so that you understand why it stopped him completely. He was looking down a corridor he had walked hundreds of times. Concrete walls, fluorescent tubes overhead, cell doors, metal, numbered, each with its small barred window. A corridor that at 2 a.m. was, by every institutional and physical law he understood, simply a corridor. Except, at the end of it, in front of cell 14, my cell, something was standing. He used the word standing in his statement, not hovering, not floating, standing, the way a person stands, upright, present, occupying space. Except it was made of light, he said, not a person with a light, not a reflection. It was, the light was the thing itself. The light was what was standing there, and it was tall, much taller than a person. I am 180 centimeters. This was, I cannot give you a precise measurement because it didn't work that way. It didn't have edges I could measure against the wall, but it was tall. It took up the corridor. He stood frozen for what he estimated was 15 to 20 seconds, though he acknowledged his sense of time was completely unreliable in that moment. Then he called for the other guards. There were 6 others on the East Wing that night. They came at different speeds and from different positions. 2 from the guards' room at the corridor entrance, 1 from the West Wing crossing over, 2 from the floor above who heard Ramadan shouting and came down. The last was a guard named Sergeant Hassan, who was the oldest of the group, 51 years old, 30 years in the service, a man who had, by his own account, seen everything a prison can show you and stopped being surprised by any of it years ago. Every one of them saw it. Their accounts differed slightly in language, the way 7 independent descriptions of the same event always differ slightly in language, because human perception is individual and human vocabulary is imprecise. But they aligned in the things that cannot be coincidence. The light, tall, filling the corridor, standing in front of cell 14, and this is the detail that I keep returning to, the detail that lives in me differently from all the others, the direction it was facing. Every single one of the 7 guards in their independent statements said the same thing. It was facing outward, facing them. Its back, if it had a back, if those words even apply, was toward my cell, toward me, toward Miriam. It was not looking at the cell. It was standing between the cell and the corridor, between me and them, guarding. I am going to stop here, and I am going to speak to whoever needs to hear this right now. Maybe you are a skeptic. Maybe you are watching this and building your rational explanation. Mass hallucination, sleep deprivation, the psychology of institutional environments and the way they distort perception. I understand. I am not asking you to abandon your skepticism cheaply. I am asking you to hold it honestly and follow the evidence where it goes. 7 independent accounts. 7. No coordination, no shared motive to fabricate. Several of these men were not religious. One of them, I learned this later, had not prayed in 11 years. Another had actively mocked a prisoner the previous month for praying aloud in his cell. These were not men predisposed to supernatural testimony. These were not men for whom angelic visitation was a comfortable category. And yet, 7 accounts, same corridor, same cell, same figure, same direction it was facing. If you have a better explanation than the one I have, I am genuinely asking you to offer it, because I have spent 2 years looking for one, and I have not found it. But let me tell you what happened after they saw it, because this is where the testimony gets even harder to explain away. Officer Ramadan took 3 steps toward the light. He told me this himself later in a conversation I will describe in Chapter 7. He said, "I don't know why I walked toward it. I should have run. Everything in my training, everything in my body said run, but I walked toward it like I was being pulled." He got within 4 meters of it, and he stopped. Not because he chose to stop, because something stopped him. He described it as like walking into a wall that wasn't there. Not painful, not violent, just stopped. Like the air itself said, "This is as far as you go." He stood there for a moment, and then he said, and this is in his official statement, word for word, I have seen a copy of it. He said, "I felt afraid, but not the fear of danger, a different fear. The fear you feel when you are in the presence of something so much larger than you that your smallness becomes the most obvious thing about you. I felt like a child. I felt like I had been a child the entire time and had only just realized it." He backed away. He went to the wall. He put his back against it and he slid down it until he was sitting on the floor of that corridor, his weapon beside him, untouched, his hands open in his lap. And he stayed there until the light was gone. The light lasted, by the guard's collective account, somewhere between 4 and 7 minutes. The variation in their estimates again speaks to the way extraordinary experience distorts temporal perception, which any psychologist will confirm, but which in this case works as corroboration rather than contradiction. They all experienced time strangely because they were all experiencing the same extraordinary thing. At 2:23 a.m., the exact moment Miriam was born, a time established independently by Dina's notation in a record that should not exist, and which I will address momentarily, the light was gone. not faded, not gradually diminished. Gone. The corridor was a corridor again. Fluorescent lights, concrete, metal doors, the ordinary architecture of institutional authority. Except for 7 men in various states of undone against the walls, none of them speaking, none of them able to immediately explain what they had just seen or what they were supposed to do next. Now let me tell you about the medical record. The prison had a doctor, Dr. Ehab, an internist pressed into prison medical service the way many Egyptian doctors of his generation were, through a combination of government requirement and limited options in the public health system. He was, by his own description and by the description of everyone who knew him, a rigorous empiricist. He believed in what he could measure. He had 2 framed degrees on his office wall, and a photograph of his graduating class, and no religious iconography of any kind. He was called to my cell at approximately 3 a.m. He examined me. He examined Miriam. I will tell you what he found, because this is where the medical impossibility enters the record, alongside the experiential testimony. Miriam was healthy, full term, within normal weight range, all reflexes present and appropriate. APGAR score, the standard newborn assessment, was, in Dr. Ehab's own words, as good as I have seen in a delivery room with full staff and equipment. Better than some. This alone was, in his medical opinion, difficult to explain given the conditions. But the truly unexplainable element was this: the cord complication that Dina had identified and managed. A complication that, without proper intervention, carries significant risk of fetal oxygen deprivation and its consequences, had been managed perfectly, professionally, with an outcome that reflected textbook-level skilled intervention. Textbook-level skilled intervention that, according to every record in that facility, had been performed by no one. Because Dina was not in the records. She was not in the visitor log. She was not in the NGO liaison list. She was not in the medical staff roster. She was not, and this was what broke Dr. Ehab's composure when he reported it. The detail that he told me later he kept returning to because it was the one that most defied his ability to rationalize. She was not on the security camera footage. The camera covering the East Wing corridor, the same corridor where 7 guards had just seen a figure of light, showed the corridor as it normally appeared. Guards, the light, the guards' reactions to the light, which was visible on camera, a brightness that the camera recorded but could not locate a source for. And at 12:40 a.m., when Dina had walked through that door, the camera showed the door opening. It showed the door opening, but it did not show who opened it. The door opened, and nothing walked through it. And yet, I was not alone in that cell. And yet, my daughter was alive. And yet, the cord complication had been managed with skilled hands that left evidence in my body that Dr. Ehab documented carefully and officially and could not explain. He wrote in his report, the unredacted version, the one he kept a copy of against orders, the one that found its way to people outside that facility through channels I am not going to name here. Patient and infant are in inexplicably good condition given circumstances of delivery. Evidence of skilled obstetric intervention present. No staff member has been identified who performed this intervention. No explanation consistent with standard medical or institutional understanding is available to me at this time. I am documenting what I found. I am not able to document who is responsible for it. A secular physician, an empiricist with 2 framed degrees, writing the word inexplicable in an official medical document, because there are moments when honesty requires you to write the word you trained yourself not to write. And then there was Lieutenant Ferris. He came to see me 3 days after the birth. Miriam was in my arms. They had given me a proper cot by then and slightly better food, with the particular awkwardness of an institution that has done something wrong and is unsure how to perform the minor corrections that acknowledge the wrong without admitting it. He came in without his notepad, without his pen. That was the first thing I noticed. The pen was always in his hand. The pen was his instrument of control, the recorder of names, the documenter of compliance, the physical symbol of his certainty that information was power, and he would eventually get the information he wanted. No pen. He sat across from me. He looked at Miriam. He looked at me. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since. I have been in this facility for 11 years. I have seen things in here. Difficult things. Things I've had to make sense of in my own way. A pause. I don't know what happened in this corridor 3 nights ago. My men have given me 7 statements. I've interviewed them separately. I've reviewed the footage. I've read Ehab's report. He stopped. I waited. I don't know what happened, he said again. Simpler this time. Quieter. As if he was saying it to himself rather than to me. As if he was still in the process of accepting that this sentence, I don't know, was the only honest sentence available to him. For a man whose entire professional identity was built on knowing, on extracting knowledge, on controlling the flow of information, on never being the person in the room without an answer, I don't know was the most significant thing Lieutenant Ferris had ever said to me. I looked at him across the small space between us. Miriam made a sound, soft, contented, entirely unconcerned with the significance of the moment. Her name, I said quietly, is Miriam. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. Not warmth exactly, or not only warmth. Something more complicated. The expression of a man whose categories have failed him, and who is standing in the rubble of his certainties, looking at a small, sleeping face, trying to figure out what to build next. I know, he said. You wrote it down, I reminded him. The first day. I know, he said again. He stood, moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and without turning around, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't catch it, "She's beautiful." Then he left. That was the last interrogation. There were no more sessions after that. No more questions. No more tapping pens and calculating silences and veiled threats about leverage. I don't know what Lieutenant Ferris did with what he saw, with what his men reported, with Ehab's document, with the footage of a door opening onto nothing. I don't know where he is now, or what he believes, or whether the rubble of that night became the foundation of something new in him, or whether he buried it under the weight of a life already in motion. I pray for him. I mean that without irony and without performance. I pray for him because he stood in the presence of something that night, or rather, stood in the documented aftermath of something that his entire system of understanding could not contain. And that is a terrifying place to be. I know because I had been in that place for 11 months. The difference is that I had found a name to call out into the darkness. I hope, wherever he is, that he eventually finds it too, because here is what that night in cell 14 taught me. Taught me not as theology, not as doctrine, not as inherited belief, but as lived, embodied, witnessed reality. God does not wait for convenient circumstances. He does not wait for clean rooms and proper equipment and the right institutional paperwork. He does not wait until you have the correct words or the strongest faith or the most impressive prayer. He comes into the impossible. He stations himself in prison corridors. He sends what is needed through doors that cameras cannot record. He makes 7 skeptical men sit on concrete floors with their weapons beside them and their certainties dissolved. He waits until there is absolutely nothing left, and then he shows up in a way that leaves no room for any explanation except him. In a prison cell, at 2:23 a.m., in the middle of the worst night of your life. That is the God I met on that floor, not the God of comfortable theology, the God of cell 14, and I will spend the rest of my life telling anyone who will listen, he is real. He was there, and if he was there, he can be anywhere, even where you are right now. There is a moment after a miracle when the world has to decide what to do with it. The miracle itself is clean. It happens. It is what it is. It carries no ambiguity in the moment of its occurrence. The light is either there or it isn't. The door either opens onto nothing or it doesn't. The baby is either alive and healthy against all medical probability or she isn't. The miracle is simple. What is not simple is the human aftermath, because miracles don't happen in a vacuum. They happen inside institutions, inside hierarchies, inside systems built on the premise that the world is explainable and controllable, and that the people at the top of those systems are the ones who determine what is real and what is permitted to be real. And when something happens that those systems cannot contain, something that 7 guards saw and a doctor documented and a security camera recorded the edges of without being able to record the center, those systems have a problem. The problem is not the miracle. The problem is the witnesses. And in Cell 14's case, in Miriam's case, in my case, there were more witnesses than Lieutenant Ferris had anticipated. Far more. Because miracles, it turns out, are extraordinarily poor at staying quiet. Let me start with Officer Ramadan. I told you he was the one who walked 3 steps toward the light and was stopped by something he described as an invisible wall. I told you he spent the remainder of that night sitting on the corridor floor with his back against the wall and his hands open in his lap. What I didn't tell you, because I was saving it for here, where it belongs, is what Officer Ramadan did the following morning. He went home after his shift. His wife told me this later. Yes, I eventually met his wife, and that story is its own kind of miracle. She said he came through the door at 7 a.m. and stood in the entrance of their apartment for a full minute without speaking. She thought something terrible had happened, a death perhaps, a colleague hurt. She went to him and she took his face in her hands, the way wives do, the ancient gesture of, "I see you, tell me." And she said, "What happened?" And Officer Ramadan, 8 years in the prison service, a man who had processed his entire career without a single recorded instance of emotional disruption, sat down on the floor of his own entrance hallway and wept. He told her everything, every detail, the light, the height of it, the way it faced outward, protecting, guarding, standing between the cell and the corridor, the way he had walked toward it and been stopped, the way the fear he felt was not the fear of danger, but the fear of smallness, of suddenly understanding your own scale in relation to something incomprehensibly larger. His wife, her name was Fatima, a quiet woman who had been secretly attending a small Christian fellowship for 2 years, unknown to her husband, unknown to anyone in their building, the way so many Egyptian Christians live their faith, in the hidden spaces of ordinary life. His wife listened to everything, and then she said, "Ramadan, I need to tell you something." What she told him changed the direction of both their lives. I will not tell that full story here because it is hers to tell, and she tells it better than I can. What I will tell you is that Officer Ramadan came back to that facility 1 week later, not on shift, on his day off, and asked to speak to me. They allowed it. The atmosphere in that facility had shifted in ways that made certain previously impossible things suddenly, quietly possible. I will explain why shortly. He sat across from me in the visitation room. No table between us this time. Someone had moved the furniture, another small, impossible thing. He was in civilian clothes. He looked like a different person from the uniformed officer I had glimpsed through my door window for 11 months. Smaller, somehow. More real. He said, "I need to understand what I saw." I know, I said. Your God, the one you pray to, is he the one who... He stopped, could not finish the sentence. Not because he didn't know what he wanted to ask, but because asking it meant accepting the framework that made the question possible. And accepting that framework meant dismantling another one. And dismantling that other one had consequences he was still calculating. I waited. Is he the one who was standing in that corridor? He finally said. I looked at him for a long moment. I believe so, I said. Not just standing there for me, between me and everything that wanted to harm me. Ramadan was quiet. For 11 months, he said. For 11 months, I said. I couldn't see him, but he was there. Another silence. Then, very quietly, I want to know more about this God. I told him everything I knew. We talked for 2 hours. The guard who eventually interrupted us looked uncomfortable, as if interrupting felt wrong, as if the conversation had a quality that made institutional authority feel somehow beside the point. Officer Ramadan left that day with a small printed Gospel of John, smuggled into the facility by the same NGO worker who had prayed over my hands 3 weeks before the birth. He took it the way you take something you are not sure you're allowed to want, carefully, quickly, with the awareness that wanting it changes you. 3 months after his transfer to another facility, a transfer that happened with suspicious speed after the administration realized what was growing in that corridor's wake, Officer Ramadan was baptized. His wife wept through the entire ceremony. She had been praying for him for 2 years. Now let me tell you about Sergeant Hassan, the oldest guard, 51 years old, 30 years in the service, the one who had, by his own account, stopped being surprised by anything. Sergeant Hassan did not weep. He did not seek me out for conversation. He did not request a Gospel of John. His response to what he saw in that corridor was, in some ways, more extraordinary than any of those things, because it was the response of a man who had built an entire identity around imperviousness, and who found, in the space of 4 to 7 minutes of unexplainable light, that the identity had always been a structure, and the structure had always been built on something less solid than he thought. He requested retirement 2 weeks after the night of Miriam's birth. 30 years of service. He walked away from a pension that required 3 more years to fully vest. I don't know what Sergeant Hassan believes now. I don't know if he found faith, or whether what he found was simply the honest acknowledgement that his previous certainty had been exposed as insufficient. But I know this. A man who had processed 30 years of institutional existence without blinking walked into a corridor at 2 a.m., saw something he could not explain, and decided that the remaining years of his life were too valuable to spend in a place that required him to pretend he hadn't seen it. That decision is its own kind of testimony. By the end of the first week after Miriam's birth, something had changed in the East Wing that I can only describe as atmospheric. I know that sounds imprecise, I know it lacks the evidentiary specificity of the medical report or the 7 independent guard statements, but everyone who was present, prisoners, guards, the facility nurse who came daily to check on Miriam and me, described the same thing, independently, in different words that all pointed to the same quality. The East Wing felt different. One prisoner, a young man named Yusuf, 23 years old, inside for reasons he never shared with me and I never asked about, knocked on my door one morning during the brief corridor access period. He was visibly nervous. He had clearly rehearsed what he was going to say and was equally clearly abandoning the rehearsal in real time. "I heard," he said, "about the night of the birth. I heard what the guards saw. News in a prison travels with an efficiency that would shame most telecommunications infrastructure. I was not surprised." "What about it?" I said. I've been trying to pray for 2 years," he said, "to Allah. I pray and I feel nothing. I've read the Quran front to back 4 times in here, and I feel..." He stopped, swallowed, lowered his voice. "I feel nothing. Empty. Like the words go up and dissolve. Like no one is receiving them. I recognize this. With my entire body, I recognize this. I know that feeling," I said. He looked at me with the desperate precision of someone who has been waiting to say the next sentence for longer than they've admitted to themselves. "How did you find the one who answers?" I told him, not a rehearsed presentation, not a theological argument, just the truth, in plain Arabic, of what had happened to me. The 11 months of silence, the night of the birth, the single word I had spoken into the darkness, and what had been standing in that corridor without my knowledge for the entire duration of my imprisonment. Yusuf listened with the attention of someone receiving water after a long thirst. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I talk to him? Right now? I don't know the words." "You don't need words," I said. "You just need honesty." We prayed together in that corridor, in whispers, in the brief window of permitted movement, in a prison in Egypt. A young Muslim man and a Coptic Christian woman with a newborn on her chest. And what I felt in that corridor as Yusuf spoke his first honest words to Jesus was the same quality I had felt in my cell on the night of the birth. Company, presence, the sense of a space that has been entered by something larger than its walls. Yusuf wept, quietly, quickly, with the specific economy of someone who has learned to express emotion in small windows before authority notices. He wiped his face, straightened, looked at me with something new in his expression. Not happiness, not yet, but the first tentative architecture of hope beginning to organize itself where emptiness had been. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," I said. "I just told you who was already looking for you." By the end of the month, 14 people in that facility had sought me out with variations of Yusuf's question. 14 prisoners and 1 guard, a young officer who had not been on shift the night of the birth, but had heard every detail from the ones who had, and who came to me with the specific urgency of someone who has been handed a key and is standing in front of a lock they've been unable to open for years. I want to be precise about what I told each of them, because I think it matters. I did not conduct a revival. I did not preach. I am not an evangelist by training or temperament. I am a woman who survived 11 months in a prison cell and gave birth in the dark, and had a visitor that no camera could record, and whose daughter is alive against every medical probability. And when people asked me why, I told them the truth. That's all I did. The truth, spoken honestly, in the right conditions, by someone who has no other agenda than accuracy, is apparently quite enough. 6 weeks after Miriam's birth, a UN human rights monitoring team visited the facility. This was officially a routine welfare assessment, the kind of institutional performance that well-run prisons submit to with practiced ease and under-resourced prisons dread. But someone had filed a report. I don't know who. I have my suspicions. The NGO woman, perhaps, or the network she moved in, or one of the guards whose conscience had been rearranged by what they saw in that corridor. Someone had filed something that elevated this particular visit from routine to targeted. The team included a Swiss doctor, a Kenyan human rights lawyer, and a Dutch field coordinator named Marta Vandenberg, who had spent 11 years in conflict and detention monitoring across sub-Saharan Africa in the Middle East. Marta was, by any measure, the least likely person to be moved by a supernatural testimony. She had seen too much. She had documented too many fabricated miracles deployed strategically by detained individuals to gain sympathy and leverage. She had a trained skeptic's eye and a field worker's immunity to manipulation. She interviewed me for 3 hours. She interviewed Officer Ramadan, now at his new facility, but reachable and willing to speak. She reviewed Dr. Ehab's report, both the official version and the fuller version that had made its way to her through channels she declined to specify to me. She reviewed the security footage. She interviewed 3 of the other guards. And then she sat back in her chair, looked at me across the table and said, in English, which she had not used for the entire 3 hours of our interview, switching to it now with the deliberateness of someone moving into a register they consider more precise. I have been doing this work for 11 years. I have interviewed hundreds of detainees. I have reviewed thousands of pages of institutional documentation. She paused. I don't know what happened in this facility on the 14th of February. I know what the records show. I know what the medical documentation shows. I know what 7 independent witnesses reported. Another pause. Marta Vandenberg was not a woman who spoke carelessly. What I can tell you is this. The convergence of evidentiary detail across multiple independent sources, combined with the medical impossibility documented by Dr. Ehab, does not have an explanation that my professional framework can accommodate. She looked at me directly. I'm going to write that in my report, she said. Exactly that. Because I refuse to write a report that is dishonest about what the evidence shows. I thought of Dr. Ehab, writing inexplicable and refusing to cross it out. There is a particular kind of courage in honesty, especially professional honesty, in institutions that reward the smoothing over of inconvenient realities. These people, a prison doctor, a UN field coordinator, chose the harder path of accuracy over the easier path of official narrative. I am grateful for them. Their courage is part of this testimony too. Marta Vandenberg's report triggered a review of my detention. The review found, with the bureaucratic indirection that institutions use when they need to correct an injustice without admitting they committed one, that my continued detention was no longer productive for ongoing investigations. I was released 6 weeks later. Miriam was 8 weeks old. I walked out of that facility on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week they had arrested me, which I only registered later and which I choose to read as a God-authored symmetry rather than coincidence, because I am allowed to read my own story. The air outside. Alexandria air. Salt and diesel, and the particular warmth of a North African morning hit me like something physical. I stood on the pavement outside the facility's gate, and I breathed it in, and I felt the sun on my face, and I looked down at Miriam, 8 weeks old, her eyes squinting at the brightness of a world she was encountering for the first time without walls around it. There it is, I told her. Your first real breath of free air. I promised you. She squinted harder, entirely unimpressed. I laughed out loud on a pavement in Alexandria. Laugh the way you laugh when the alternative is weeping and you choose laughter because your daughter is 8 weeks old and you are standing in sunlight and you made it. We made it. But I need to tell you something that I promised you honesty would require me to say. Walking out of that facility did not end the difficulty. It relocated it. Lieutenant Ferris had been moved to a different position. Quietly, quickly, the way institutions manage people who have become inconvenient. But the system that produced him was unchanged. The network of informants that had identified our house church was unchanged. My husband's job had been lost in my absence. Our apartment, we learned within 2 weeks of my release, had been visited. Things had been taken. A message had been sent. And I was now, as I had been warned I would be, famous in the worst possible way. The story of Cell 14 had moved through networks I had no visibility into. I was the woman whose birth had made 7 guards unable to explain what they saw. In some circles, that made me a person of interest for reasons of faith. In other circles, it made me a target for reasons of politics. We left Alexandria 3 weeks after my release. I will not tell you where we went first, or the route, or who helped us, because those networks still function and the people in them still need their safety more than I need my story to be complete. What I will tell you is that we were not alone. We were never alone. Every stage of what came next, every checkpoint, every border, every moment when the road ahead seemed closed, there was something. A door opening, a stranger with the right connection, a guard who looked at Miriam's face and made a decision, provision that arrived precisely when the alternative would have been catastrophic. I stopped being surprised. I had learned in Cell 14 that this is simply how he operates, not by removing the difficulty, by being present inside it, by stationing himself between you and what wants to destroy you, whether you can see him there or not. Whether you can see him there or not. I am still learning how to live in the light of that. It is not easy. I want to be honest with you about that. Some days the trauma is louder than the miracle. Some days I wake at 2 a.m., the same hour, and for a moment I am back on that floor, and the fear is as immediate as it ever was. But then Miriam moves beside me, and I remember God was in that corridor before I called out to him. He was there for 11 months of silence. He was there in the woman across the corridor who pushed a card under her door. He was there in the NGO woman's hands, covering mine. He was there in Dina, whatever Dina was. He was there in the light. He was there in Officer Ramadan's open hands on a corridor floor. He was there in Dr. Ehab's refusal to cross out an honest word. He was there in Marta Vandenberg's courage to write what the evidence showed. He was there in every closed door that eventually opened. He was always there. I was the one who couldn't see it. Until the night he made it impossible to miss. Miriam is 2 years old now. I want you to see her the way I see her every morning when she wakes up. She does not wake quietly. She has never done anything quietly, not since the moment she announced her arrival in that prison cell with a cry that could have woken the entire East Wing, and probably did. She wakes with the full body commitment of someone who has decided that consciousness is worth celebrating. Arms up, eyes wide, a sound that is somewhere between a declaration and a demand. I am here. The day can begin. Every single morning when I hear that sound, something in me says, thank you. Not as a liturgical formality, not as a religious habit, as a genuine, specific, personal thank you. Because I know what the alternative was. I was there on the floor of Cell 14. I know what the probability of that morning looked like at 2 a.m. on the 14th of February. I know what Dr. Ehab wrote in his report. I know what the cord complication meant without intervention. I know. And she is here anyway. Arms up, eyes wide, impossibly, magnificently here. Thank you. I want to tell you what my life looks like now. Not because it is glamorous or comfortable, because it is neither of those things, but because I think the truth of the aftermath is as important as the truth of the miracle. People tell testimonies, and sometimes they jump from the miracle to the resolution. from the impossible to the beautiful, as if the road between them is a straight line. It is not. I want to honor your intelligence and your own experience enough to tell you the truth. The road between the miracle and the life you build after it is long and uneven, and sometimes it doubles back. We are living in a refugee resettlement community. I will not specify the country, not out of fear for myself, but out of respect for the others living here alongside us, whose safety is not mine to risk with specificity. What I will tell you is that our home is one room, concrete block walls, a window that faces a courtyard where children play in the late afternoon when the heat breaks. We have a bed, a small cooking space, a table where Miriam eats and draws and conducts the serious business of being 2 years old with the focus of a doctoral student. My husband is here. That is the sentence that still requires me to pause and receive it fully every time I say it. My husband is here. The months of my imprisonment were their own kind of torture for him. The not knowing, the inability to reach me, the bureaucratic violence of systems that will not tell a man whether his wife is alive. He is a quieter person now than the man I married. Some of what those months took from him has come back. Some of it, I think, is permanently redistributed, moved from the place where lightness lived into something deeper and more serious that I love in him, even as I grieve what produced it. We are together. We are alive. Miriam has both her parents. Everything else is detail. But I need to tell you what happened to the mission, because Cell 14 did not just produce a miracle. It produced a responsibility. You do not receive what I received and keep it to yourself. That is not ingratitude exactly. It is just structural impossibility. What happened in that corridor? What happened on that floor? What happened in the 7 statements and the medical report and Marta Vandenberg's 3 hours of professional reckoning? That is not a private experience. It became a public one the moment 7 people witnessed it, and a public miracle carries a public obligation. I began telling the story 6 weeks after my release, haltingly at first, to my husband, who listened with the expression of a man receiving back something he had grieved as lost. Then to a small gathering of believers in a house not unlike Bishoy's apartment in Alexandria. Plastic chairs, foam cushions, chipped tea glasses, the same ancient intimacy of people who have chosen to be in the same room despite the cost of being in the same room. I told the story, and I watched what happened to people when they heard it. I watched a woman who had not wept in 2 years of displacement begin to weep, not in despair, but in the specific release of someone whose grief has finally been given permission to exist alongside hope simultaneously. I watched a young man who had arrived at that gathering wearing the expression of someone who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that God was not worth the energy of disbelief or belief. I watched his face change, not dramatically, subtly, the way ice changes before it melts. A quality shift, invisible until it isn't. I watched an elderly man, a Muslim who had come because his Christian neighbor had dragged him along and he had not wanted to be rude, sit very still through my entire testimony and then ask, at the end, in the direct way of older men who have stopped having time for indirection, "This Jesus you speak of, is he available to a man my age?" I said, "He was available to me on the floor of a prison cell. I cannot imagine any address he would refuse." The old man nodded slowly, thought about this for a moment, then said, "Then I would like to speak to him." I have told this story in camps, in resettlement communities, in church halls and living rooms and courtyards, and now here to you, more times than I can count. And every time, every single time, something happens to someone in the room. The story is not mine. It was given to me for exactly this purpose. I am, as I told you in the very first chapter, a witness. That is my entire qualification and my entire job description. I am a witness, and witnesses testify. Now I need to speak to you directly, not to the room in general, to you specifically, the person whose eyes are on this screen right now. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you brought to this video. Whether you came searching or whether you stumbled here from an algorithm that understood something about your night better than you do. I don't know if you are in pain or in comfort, in faith or in doubt, in a refugee camp or in a living room in a country that has never known what it means to flee. But I know this: you are watching. And people do not accidentally watch a 50-minute testimony about a prison birth and an angelic visitation unless something in them is reaching for something they haven't yet found. So let me reach back to my Muslim brothers and sisters. I know your tradition. I was raised beside it. I know the weight of the Shahada and the discipline of Salah and the community of Ramadan and the genuine sincerity of millions of people who love Allah and are trying faithfully and seriously to live well before Him. I am not here to disrespect any of that. I am here to tell you what I experienced. And what I experienced is this: the day I called out the name of Jesus, not as a theological statement, not as a conversion declaration, but as a desperate human being calling out to someone real, He answered, not with words, with presence, with a figure of light in a corridor, with a woman who appeared through a door that cameras could not record, with a daughter who should not be alive and is. I was not looking for a new religion. I was looking for a real God. And the God who answered me is the God who also says, in the Quran you revere, Isa, Jesus, is the Word of God, the Spirit of God, born of a virgin, able to heal, able to raise the dead. I am not asking you to abandon your prayers. I am asking you, have they been answered? Have you felt the presence you are praying toward? And if there is a God who answers, don't you want to know him? Call out to Jesus, not as a betrayal, as a question. If you are who they say you are, show me. He answered that question for me on a prison floor. He will answer it for you wherever you are right now. To my atheist and skeptical friends, I respect your skepticism. I told you at the beginning of this chapter, I was raised by an engineer and a school teacher. Rigor is not foreign to me. Evidence matters to me. So let me give you what I have. 7 independent witness statements, uncoordinated, from individuals without shared motive to fabricate, describing the same event in the same location with the same specific details. A medical report from a secular physician documenting an outcome he described as medically impossible given the conditions, performed by a person who appears in no institutional record. Security footage showing a door opening onto an empty corridor. The door opening is on the footage. The person who opened it is not. A UN field monitor with 11 years of experience, writing in an official document that the convergence of evidence has no explanation her professional framework can accommodate. That is not faith. That is a body of evidence. I am not asking you to believe before you investigate. I am asking you to investigate honestly, to follow the evidence where it goes, even when it goes somewhere your existing framework cannot comfortably contain. And then, when you have investigated, when you have run your explanations and found them insufficient, I am asking you to do what Dr. Ehab did, what Marta Vandenberg did, what Officer Ramadan did, standing in that corridor with his hands open. Have the courage to write the honest word, even if the honest word is, I don't know, but I want to. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is exactly where Jesus meets people, in the honest, I don't know. To my Christian brothers and sisters, I love you, and because I love you, I am going to tell you something that the comfort of institutional Christianity sometimes makes it easy to forget. Miracles did not end with the Bible. They did not end with the early church. They did not end with the Desert Fathers or the Coptic martyrs or the underground churches of the 20th century. They are not relegated to the mission field or the global south or the places where faith is sufficiently desperate to produce supernatural response. They are available to you now, in your ordinary life, in your unanswered prayers, in your 3 a.m. on a floor that is not concrete, that feels just as cold. Stop living like the God of Cell 14 is the God of another era. He is the same God. He still stations himself in corridors. He still sends what is needed through doors that should not open. He still waits until there is nothing left, so that when he moves, no one can attribute it to anything smaller than him. Stop praying at him. Start talking to him the way I did, raw, angry, honest, without the correct words or the proper posture or the theological precision. Just, I can't feel you anymore. I need you to be real right now. He can work with that. He has always been able to work with that. To everyone, to every human being watching this, regardless of what you believe or what you've survived or what you're facing, if God can station an angel in a prison corridor in Egypt for 11 months to guard a woman who didn't even know it was there, if he can send a midwife through a door that leaves no record of her passing, if he can make 7 hardened prison officers sit on a floor with their weapons beside them and their certainties dissolved, if he can bring a little girl into the world in a concrete cell at 2:23 in the morning and make her so furiously, magnificently, undeniably alive that a secular doctor writes the word inexplicable and refuses to cross it out, then he can handle what you're carrying. Whatever it is, the diagnosis, the marriage, the addiction, the grief that has no bottom, the faith that has gone silent, the life that looks nothing like what you planned and everything like what you were afraid of. He can handle it. Not from a distance, not as a theological principle, personally, specifically, in your actual cell, whatever shape its walls take. He was in mine before I knew he was there. He is in yours right now. I want to close with a prayer, not a formal one, not a liturgical one, the kind I prayed on that floor. Honest, direct, without performance. If you want to pray it with me, pray it with me. Out loud if you can, in your head if that's all you have right now, in whatever language lives closest to your heart. Jesus, I don't know if I believe everything yet. I don't know if I have the right words or the right history or enough faith to make this count. But I watched what you did in a prison cell. I watched what you did in a corridor. I watched you answer a woman who had nothing left but one word, your name. And I'm saying that name now, not because I have everything figured out, because I have nothing figured out and I am tired of pretending otherwise. Jesus, if you can be in cell 14, be here. If you can stand between a woman and everything that wants to destroy her, stand between me and what is destroying me. If you were there before she knew you were there, be here before I fully understand what I'm asking. I'm asking. I'm here. Find me. Amen. Miriam is 2 years old. She wakes up every morning with her arms up and her eyes wide, and a sound that is somewhere between a declaration and a demand. I am here. The day can begin. She does not know yet what it costs to get her here. She does not know about the concrete floor, or the cord complication, or the 7 guards, or the light in the corridor, or Dr. Ehab's honest word, or Officer Ramadan's open hands. She does not know about Lieutenant Ferris, or the tapping pen, or the 11 months of silence that turned out not to be silence at all. She will know. I will tell her when she is old enough to carry it and young enough to still be shaped by it in the direction of wonder rather than bitterness. I will tell her that the night she was born, someone was standing in the corridor outside the room where she came into the world, tall, made of light, facing outward, guarding. That the first geography she ever occupied, the first air she ever breathed, was under guard. That she was chosen before she was born to be the kind of impossible that makes doctors write honest words and officers sit on floors with their hands open and old men ask if Jesus is available to mend their age, and young men pray in whispers in prison corridors, and a woman on a concrete floor discover that the silence she had been living in was not absence at all, but the particular quality of a presence so large and so close that it had surrounded her so completely she had mistaken it for emptiness. I will tell her all of this, and she will look at me with those wide eyes and probably demand a snack immediately afterward, because she is 2, and that is what 2-year-olds do. And I will get her the snack, and I will look at her face, the face that was in that cell, the face that a secular doctor called inexplicably healthy, the face that made Lieutenant Ferris pause at a doorframe and say she's beautiful to a wall. And I will say quietly, in the ordinary miracle of an ordinary morning, thank you, thank you, thank you. Do not wait for the militia to surround you. Do not wait for the fire. Do not wait for the floor. Call on him now. He is not far. He has never been far. He is standing in your corridor right now, facing outward, guarding. Call his name. He will answer. He always answers.